right, so thank you so much to everyone who joined. My name is Manasa Meenakshi.
Peniel Kumalo.
And today we present to you Dr. Jamie Fader. So Dr. Fader uses the life course perspective and qualitative research to basically examine how the criminal legal system impacts lived experience and identity construction. She's the author of Falling Back, Incarcerated and Transitions to Adulthood Among Urban Youth, which was recognized as the best book of 2016. So Dr. Fader, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And I want to thank everybody who is joining me on a Saturday afternoon or evening, giving up your time on the weekend to talk about justice issues. So I'm going to share some slides and just give you a little bit of a kind of idea of what to expect from the presentation. I wanted to focus on the different ways that young people are criminalized and what the consequences are once somebody enters either the juvenile or the adult system. So what I'm going to talk about, it kind of falls into two buckets. What brings young people into the system, and then what happens to them once they're on the inside and after. And I understand that we're going to have some questions from the hosts after this, and hopefully some time left over for questions from the audience as well. So just to take a look at the juvenile court caseload in the most recent year that we have data, what I really want you to focus on here are two things. One, which I'm circling here with my cursor, is that almost 750,000 young people come through juvenile courts in the United States every year. And the other thing I'd like to point out to you is over here in this line graph that we, as a system, really peaked in terms of number of kids involved in the system around 1996. There was a big violent crime wave during that time, and a lot of harsh legislation that was developed in its wake. And since then, you can see a pretty dramatic decline in the number of kids coming into the system. I also wanted to kind of take a look at the kinds of offenses that bring kids into the system. Person offenses are essentially violent offenses, and here are all the examples of them, right? So you can see here, looking at the violent offenses, the very largest group of violent offenses is simple assault, which is a fancy term for fighting, something that a lot of adolescents do, and not all get arrested for. Property crimes are pretty common. And if we look here at larceny theft, that's our largest group. That's stealing something with a small kind of value. And then public order offenses bring in 175,000 young people each year. And these are for offenses that essentially are sometimes called victimless crimes. They offend our sensibilities, essentially. So we've got obstruction of justice. An example of that would be refusing to comply with a police officer, disorderly conduct, liquor law violations, and so on. So the upshot from this kind of breakdown here is that most young people who come into the system are engaged in pretty non-serious offending. And there's been a lot of talk recently about a juvenile violent crime wave, a lot of media attention to carjackings and gun violence. And so the early data from 2020 show that young people are not committing a greater proportion of the crime than they used to. So this is pre-pandemic 2019 versus 2020. It looks like young people are 2017 through 2019. Looks like young people are across the board committing a lower share of all crime than they were in those pre-pandemic years. And that we aren't going through a violent crime wave right now. If you compare 2019 to 2020, we're actually looking at lower numbers of offenses. So it's easy to get distracted by media, kind of sensational media accounts of young people involved in violent crime. And the people who are kind of pushing that narrative are interested in pushing a bunch of policies that would look like those policies in the mid-90s. So it's a real concern for those of us in the justice space. What science tells us about youthful offending is that it's normal. And I mean, that's a loaded word, normal. But what I mean is that most people do it. Most people engage in it during their teen years. Most people grow out of it. But only some young people who break the law are processed as delinquent. And you may know from your justice conversations that it's not randomly distributed. That the system is very focused at every stage on kids of color and on sexual minority youth as well. So system involvement, once a young person kind of penetrates the system, the process of stopping crime becomes harder to do. And what's important to know is that adolescence is a formative period in our life. So the way that we intervene with young people is really important. We can have really positive effects or really negative effects during this period of life. So brain development tells us a little bit why young people are so engaged in risky behavior, including law breaking. And these are functional MRI images of young people at different stages. And you can see that brain development is continuing to happen into the 20s. And we could even extend this graphic out to age 25. Our brains are continuing to develop until our mid-20s. And the very last part of our brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. That's the part of our brain that's responsible for executive functions like decision making. So until we become in our mid-20s, we're not really fully capable of making informed decisions. So the way that cognition works during adolescence is that that prefrontal cortex is weighing things not in a kind of logical, objective way. Rather, young people are weighing their decisions in terms of thinking more heavily about the reward than about the risk that comes along with it. More heavily basing decisions on emotions rather than reason, very focused on the present rather than the future. And studies show that young people can accomplish the two basic cognitive functions of understanding and reasoning pretty much just like adults by the time that they're age 16, but that is essentially only in a lab setting. Once young people are out in the world and they're engaged with peers and other things are going on, we found that young people are not able to deploy those skills in real world settings on a regular basis. So we're essentially looking at a period of life where young people are taking a lot of risks, including breaking the law. We can also look at the age crime curve, which is one of the longest established facts in criminology. This very same curve was identified in the 1700s by Adolf Quetelet. And what we see here is that we've got the age on the bottom axis and the number of crimes per population on the upper one here. And we see that in this period between 12 and 16, nonviolent offending goes way up, right? Violent offending also increases, but a much slower increase. And then by the time we get to our 20s, especially right here around 24, 25, we see a very steep decline in participation in law breaking. And this goes right along with what brain scientists have said that by that time, we're able to reason and understand a lot more thoroughly. So we've got these two contrasting perspectives. One comes from brain science and psychology, and it basically says that adolescence is a unique period of time and that crime is normal or expected during teen years. And if that's true, we might think, well, what should we do about it? And I think the answer is, provide supportive services, allow kids to grow and develop normally without intervening in a way that might be harmful. But that's not typically the way that the justice system or systems approach law breaking. They very often use a medical model, which suggests that crime is a pathology or kind of a disease that needs to be cured. So we'll see this in a little bit when I talk about what happens when young people come into the system and receive treatment. So how do young people get criminalized? I can think of a handful of ways. I'm going to talk about status offenses, the school to prison pipeline, stop, question, and frisk, which are police policies. But we could, we could add to this list all day. We can look at juvenile curfew laws, which are, at least here in Philadelphia, they're in effect right now because we're in the middle of a gun violence crisis. I don't know if y'all are familiar with these things called mosquitoes. They're used very often at parks or rec centers, and they send off a high frequency noise that can only be heard by young people because of the development of their ears. So essentially, it's so annoying, it keeps young people from congregating in those spaces, and it's meant to do that. And of course, convenience stores very often will have rules about how many teenagers can be in the store at one time. Our local convenience store has closed now between 2 and 3 because that's when the high school gets out. So these are just examples of how young people are criminalized in everyday life. Status offenses are a whole class of so-called offenses that are only crimes for people who are under the age of majority. So typically under 18. The term status offense here, this is a report by Vera Institute of Justice, implies that a kid has committed a crime, but they're anything but criminal. These crimes, so-called crimes, involve disobeying adults, running away from school, running away from home, truancy, curfew violations, underage drinking, or disobeying parents or teachers. And we have, over 100,000 kids per year who are brought into the system on these offenses that are not even really offenses. So that's 1 in 11 kids coming into the juvenile system having committed one of these very low-level kinds of misbehaviors. The second place where we see a good deal of criminalization is in schools. And this graphic, even though the figures are pretty old, highlights an important point, which is that the kinds of school discipline that we see targeting Black and brown youth starts as early as preschool, right? So we have 3-year-old kids who are getting suspended and expelled from school. Way that you might want to read this chart here, let's focus here on the green group, on the kind of dark blue group here. So Black or African American, 18% of overall enrollment in preschools are students that are Black or African American, but 42% of kids with out of school suspensions are Black. So that's 3 times what we would expect. There's obviously something going on there. And then almost half of young people who are suspended out of school from preschools multiple times are kids who are Black or African American. So we see this kind of criminalizing of youth very, very early in life, as soon as young people get to schools. And these racial disparities just continue through elementary, middle school, and high school. Here are suspension data for girls and boys in these are Department of Education figures for high schools, I believe. So what this shows is that Black boys are suspended 3 times as often as white boys. Black girls are suspended 6 times as often as white girls. So we see Black girls have the highest rates of disproportionate suspension. When you dig down into these figures and see what is it, what is the behavior that's causing the suspension? A lot of these are, interpreted by teachers or administrators or school police as defiance, talking back, not being in compliance with the school dress code, perhaps because you've got locks or other hair that doesn't fit into the norm. A lot of students who are LGBTQ, non-binary, or non-binary are also targeted by these kinds of codes. They may be holding hands with a same-sex partner in the hallway. They may be dressing different than their gender presentation may be different than the gender they were born with. And these kind of really minor behavioral issues have turned into things that result in suspension, expulsion, and even arrest at times. Here's just some numbers about LGBTQIA youth in the juvenile justice system. So 40% of girls in juvenile justice facilities identify as lesbian. And 85% of LGBTQ youth in the system are youth of color. So we really have to take an intersectional frame to understand how very vulnerable young people are kind of being swept into the system. So this was my attempt at kind of trying to draw the pipeline. So if we start on the left-hand side here with, let's just start with suspension and expulsion. As soon as somebody is suspended, they are 3 times more likely than their counterparts to drop out of school. And if you've ever been suspended, you probably can figure out why. You start missing material, start missing classes, you get behind, and then it's easier to drop out than to go back. Same for school arrest. If you're arrested in school, you're 3.5 times as likely as your counterparts to drop out of school. Dropping out leads to poor employment outcomes. It also leads to a much higher likelihood of being arrested as an adult or imprisoned. School arrest leads to involvement in the juvenile justice system, which then leads to, again, poor employment outcomes and a higher likelihood of adult arrest. That leads to more poor employment outcomes and higher rates of reoffending and reincarceration. And that's the kind of revolving door part of the pipeline. One study found that 20% of the Black-white gap in reading and math scores are explained by differential rates of suspension. So this has real effects on young people's ability to complete their schooling. What comes after the school to prison pipeline? This is a comparison of educational outcomes for people who were formerly incarcerated versus the general public. And you can see over on the right-hand side here, very few people who have been incarcerated complete a college degree compared to those in the general population. 2 out of 3 jobs right now require a college degree. So having no college degree essentially limits people to low-wage work. The third way that young people are criminalized is through over-policing. And this was really visible during stop, question, and frisk policies that were very popular all over the place, but especially in New York and also here in Philadelphia. This is a graphic that came from a report that the Vera Institute of Justice did, where they interviewed people who were in 5 communities most heavily impacted by police patrols and talked with young people there. So 80% of the young people they spoke with had been stopped by police at least once in their lifetime. 44% reported being stopped at least 9 times in their lifetime. And some reported more than 20 stops. And if you're interested in this line of research, there's a professor in San Francisco named Nikki Jones, who's done work in this area. And she finds that young people who are traveling to and from school or other activities after school come into contact with police so regularly that it just becomes routine for them. They very often, as she was observing, would help police search them by pulling up their shirts and showing that they weren't carrying any weapons, just to make the interaction easier. But of course, these interactions are terrifying because they could go so terribly wrong. And even when they're not deadly, they're very often very degrading experiences and don't involve a lot of respect. As a result of our over-policing of young people, arrest is now commonplace. So a study done a little less than 10 years ago found that 38% of white men and 49% of Black men are arrested by age 23. This is becoming a normal experience for young people. So let's take a look at the second question. What happens once kids are brought into the system? This is a great graphic that's done by the Prison Policy Initiative. They call it the whole pie. And this is basically represents 48,000 young people who are held in facilities away from home after breaking the law. The largest group of these young people are in detention centers. Those are meant to be short-term stays, but they're basically like jails. They're the juvenile counterpart to adult jails. Young people go there before they've had a hearing to determine their guilt. And I'm just going to point out a couple other things here. Adult prisons and jails, about 4,500 kids are in adult prisons and jails every year. And another 10,000 or more go to residential treatment, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Even sooner than a second, right now. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about my book, which focused on young people, young men who were, they were all arrested for drug selling in Philadelphia, and they were incarcerated at a residential facility or a reform school that I call Mountain Ridge Academy. It's not the real name, but that's what I call it in the book. So I got to know these young men while they were incarcerated, and then I followed them back to Philadelphia, and I followed them intensely for 3 years, and just wrote about their lives. How are they experiencing incarceration? What's going on when they come home and they're expected to take on adult roles, but they've been missing from their communities, they've been missing from their schools and their families for some time. And now these young men are in their mid to late 30s, and I'm in touch with about half of them. Oops. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that. If I even touch that cord, all of a sudden my camera goes off. I should know better by now not to touch that. Okay, so here's a picture of the place I call Mountain Ridge Academy. Looks kind of nice, right? It's out in the middle of a field, and there's a bunch of trees, and There aren't any fences, there aren't any, there's no barbed wire, there's no bars on the windows, there's no locks on the doors. But this is the kind of place that many young people go to. They're sometimes called residential treatment facilities, or I like the old term reform schools because it kind of reminds us of what they are. This one is about 5 hours west of Philly. It's private and for-profit, which is interesting. If you go to their agency's webpage, the first thing that you'll see is their stock quote from today, because they're ultimately beholden to the stockholders. I chose this program because of all of the residential facilities that kids from Philly could go to, this was considered the best by probation officers and judges. They took boys age 13 to 18, average length of stay was 10 months. And they used this intervention known as criminal thinking errors, which is actually really commonly used in juvenile facilities, adult facilities, and substance abuse treatment. Criminal thinking errors intervention was kind of invented by these two forensic psychologists down in Maryland. They worked for St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the criminally insane. And during their time working with young people, they kind of developed this theory that young people who break the law have different cognitive patterns than people who don't break the law. And they identified a number of them. I think there's 22, 28 or whatever, but these are the kind of key ones that are used at Mountain Ridge Academy. You may be looking at some of these and wondering, why is anger a thinking error? Good question. Why is it an error to view yourself as a good person? Good question. Some of these, from a scientific perspective, lack what we call face validity, which means they don't make a lot of sense when you look at them. And yet, even though it's been debunked in the scientific community, it's still used very commonly in corrections programs. Right. So the way that this works is that young people are supposed to memorize all of these criminal thinking errors, and they're supposed to be able to identify the thinking error as it's happening and then stop the thought and replace it with a more pro-social law abiding thought. Right. So it's a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. And what's interesting is that when young people are sent to Mountain Ridge Academy and other similar reform schools, they don't have a sentence. It's not like they're going to, serve a sentence of 9 months or 12 months. They're going there indefinitely until the staff say that they are fixed, until their pathology that caused their crime is fixed. So, the idea is that when the program promotes a change in thinking, that leads to a change in behavior. And based on behavior, then young people earn their release, right? So you might be guessing right now that a lot of people figure this out. Like, oh, what do I need to tell my counselor in order to get out of here? So they have something that many young men talked with me about called fake it to make it. Telling your counselor what it is that they want to hear. And young people in the program found themselves in a series of double binds. So they were almost in a situation where they couldn't do right by the program's rules. So James told me that if I tell them I'm angry about being locked up, I've avoided one thinking error called closed channel communication. But then I made another error, anger. I tell them that I'm angry, and then that goes in my file and comes back again during my status meaning that he's not going to be able to go home because he was angry. One of the most disturbing aspects of thinking errors as it was played out at Mountain Ridge Academy is that on the first day, young people went through a like an orientation. And this was the last thing they're told. We are aware that you may go through a period of monasticism where you will try to avoid all criminal thinking and actions. You will eventually grow tired of this and start looking for excitement again. Violation equals excitement. You will seek it out because that's the way you are. So think about how you might feel if you were hearing from these strangers out in the middle of nowhere that you are a criminal, right? Because that's the way you are. You're probably not going to change. It's not a good feeling when I imagine myself there. And it encourages young people to internalize an individualistic definition of the problem, right? So I say to Gabe, from the program's perspective, you're here because you made bad choices. And he says, I agree. Selling drugs was bad because I let my instant gratification get the best of me. I wanted to provide myself, but I didn't want to get a job. That was a bad choice right there, just going out there and selling drugs to get money when I could have just got it the legal way. And I'd still been home right now. But I ain't going to say what if, because if what if was a fifth, we'd all be drunk. So Gabe didn't really challenge the way that the program framed his choice to sell drugs. Okay, so this is just a quick picture of how the young men in my study did after they came home. Within the first 6 weeks after returning home, 2 of them had been arrested, 1 of them had been murdered, and 2 of them had resumed drug selling, but only told me about it. That's the self-report, SR. Right? And you can see here, over the next couple years, they're generating a whole lot of arrests and a lot of time in adult jails and prisons after this. And these cases aren't unique. The statistics on failure after these kind of programs are right in line with this. So I'm not saying that the program caused them to commit crime after they left, but it didn't help, that's for sure. So there are so many problems with thinking change therapies, but the one I'm going to land on here is that when we define a problem as a cognitive problem or a personality problem, or even just a pathology that can be cured with treatment, we're ignoring all the structural conditions that are behind offending, like the young men in our study were doing, right? They're selling drugs largely because that was the job that was available to them in impoverished communities in Philly. They had a lot of unmet needs. They had very few resources. And instead of addressing those needs and resources, we incarcerated them, gave a whole bunch of money to Mountain Ridge Academy and other places to try to cure them, which seems problematic to me. Just a reminder that Mountain Ridge Academy is kind of the best kind of residential treatment program, and lots of them are have been found to do a lot worse in terms of abuse scandals. Here we have Glen Mills, which is just right outside Philly. Young people coming home from Glen Mills have told us for decades that the staff there put their hands on them, but no one listened until finally they did. They closed down the school for 2 years, and now they're looking to reopen under a new name. How much does all of this cost? $214,000 a year per kid, right? That's $588 a day to lock someone up. So I thought it would be fun just to take a look at how much it would cost to send a kid to Harvard, right? $52,000 a year. Right? We could send these kids to Harvard and save a ton of money and a whole lot of pain. If you look at all of the social costs of locking young people up, we're somewhere between $8 and $21 billion. When we think about the fact that these young people are earning less money, they're graduating high school less, they're paying less in taxes, etc. And this just shows you looking at the range of recidivism or reoffending after youth incarceration. We're really looking at failure being kind of the norm. When we send young people to the adult system, it's even worse, right? And the racial disparities among kids who go to the adult system are even bigger. So African American youth are 9 times, and Latinx youth are 4 times as likely as white youth to go to have an adult prison sentence for the same crime. Right? This is not about committing more dangerous acts. This is for the same crime. And when we transfer young people to the adult system, there's a whole host of negative consequences. Children are 5 times as likely to be sexually assaulted than in juvenile facilities in the first 48 hours. They have higher risk of reoffending afterward. They're unable to get reconnected to education. They've got longer sentences. And there are penalties in terms of employment, wages, voting, marriage, etc., and mental health problems. So as critical as I am of the juvenile justice system, sending kids to the adult system is even worse. And that's where I'm going to finish. Hope I didn't blab on too long, and open up for questions.
All righty. I'll start us off with our first question, and that is, what do you want to focus your studies? What made you want to focus your studies and profession around the criminal legal system? Is there a story behind it? Was it something that like really interested you?
Yeah, I don't think I really appreciated this until I got to college and started taking criminal justice courses, but I became acutely aware of my privilege because I did a lot of dirt when I was a kid, a lot of dirt. And I can remember one occasion where my parents had told me if I got one more speeding ticket, I was going to have my license taken away. And it was the 3rd time I see the lights in the rear view, and I literally don't even think. I just start pressing the accelerator and trying to evade the police. So I take them on a slow speed chase in my parents' 4-cylinder car, and eventually get caught. And the guy says to me, the officer said, "Were you trying to outrun me?" And of course, I'm crying. I'm like, "Yes, sir, I was." And he let me off even without a ticket. Right? So, of course, growing up in a white middle-class suburb, I didn't really reflect on that moment until I got some perspective and learned that, that I was really, really lucky that day. And it's very obviously my skin privilege that got me there. So I think what continues to drive my interest in youth justice is the unfairness, right? That young people can't even be just enjoy their teenage years without being criminalized.
So when you say that you found like an interest in college, was this like a part of your major that you had already decided? Or like, was this something that like after this incident happened, you were like, oh, I want to start focusing more on this?
No, it definitely wasn't. It was later in college. I took a couple classes with really great instructors, and they just kind of ignited my interest in this. And it made me want to become a college professor and do the same for young people.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. So the second question that I have for you is in regards to your book. So how extensive was your research with these young boys? So did you follow the stories that they reported, or did you really observe like a few using like observation techniques?
Yeah, so the 15 young men who I studied, I followed them very closely for 3 years. So mostly I was their Uber driver. I took them to their court appointments, or I don't know, and take their kids to get health checkups. was in the hospital when their kids were born, was at the church when their loved ones passed, just really like got into their lives and became part of their extended families. So I got very close to them, which is challenging in lots of ways. But it's such an important way of doing research to really, really, really understand somebody. I mean, you can do an interview with somebody, but it's nothing like getting to know them over a period of years and getting to know their family members and their friends. So yeah, that's what that research entailed.
All right. And the third question we have for you is, do you do field work or just ask for the accounts of like the young men you observed?
So for this book, I did a lot of field work. So I was all over the city. Unfortunately, now that I'm a professor, I have less time to be out in the field. And so I tend to rely on interviews. But they're not the same.
All right. And did you like choose these young boys, or like how did you like base your research?
So I went out to Mountain Ridge Academy and they gave me a list of boys who were from Philadelphia and who were pretty close to being released. And then I just went through that list and invited them all to be part of the study. And no one said no. I think because it's just so boring in this place, you know, talking with somebody and you know, about your experiences is kind of freeing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And what is the most common type of crime that these juveniles are arrested for?
So for the young men that I followed, it was drug selling. And most of them sold weed. Most of them didn't sell anything harder than that. So, you know, of course, I was collecting data in 2004 before cannabis was, you know, legalized in so many places and decriminalized in others. But there still are so many people serving prison sentences for selling cannabis. It's really something we need to address.
What made you really like focus on Mountain View? Like, why not go to like, I don't know if you did, but like go to other like jails, like county jails and other places where young boys and men were incarcerated?
That's a great question. I had a feeling that something, well, how do I want to describe it? I mean, I chose Mountain Ridge Academy because everybody thought it was the best. And I had a feeling that it was problematic. I just, you know, had a feeling. So, you know, digging into that, I was thinking, well, if this is the best and it's still so problematic, then we can only imagine what the worst would be.
Yeah.
And how do your studies compare to young women in the criminal justice system? Because I know that young women and young men have different roles in society. So how would reintegrating for young women potentially look like?
That's a great question. And it's true that women and girls take different pathways into the system. Very often, they're so-called accomplices along with male offenders. And very often have substance abuse, addiction issues. And so when they come home from jail or prison, some women's issues are the same as men, you know, finding a place to live or whatever, but some are more complicated because most women in prison are mothers. They may have lost custody of their children while they were locked up, or may have had them staying with relatives. So they have to try to reunite their families again. And many of them are battling those addictions and trying to stay clean in the community, and trying to stay away from the men who, you know, kind of played a role in their getting in trouble. So there's a couple great books written about women's reentry issues, and they are in many ways different than men's.
And for my next question, you already covered a little bit about this in your presentation about how like the way these young men grew up, like their society and the different places where they were raised, like kind of contribute to why they were incarcerated. So it's for my next question, what are like some of the characteristics of people that you see today, you know, having gone through the pandemic and different, like, you know, quarantine and all of these different things? How do you think that like contributes to how people are today?
I think one of the biggest problems or shocks that young people went through during the pandemic is that a lot of their resources got shut down.
Mm-hmm.
So their schools were shut down. A lot of young people rely on their schools for food. So there was a lot more food insecurity for a period of time. And a lot of the nonprofits that we have in Philly, and I'm sure all over, had to close down. And so they lost all of their recreation, they lost all of their mentoring programs, they lost all of LGBTQ kids, lost their, their safe place to go drop in and, to be who they were. Many of them were, locked at home with parents that don't accept them. So this was a really hard period of time for young people. And we're going to be seeing the after effects of the pandemic for a while, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, and what are some less punitive alternatives to youth courts or to juvenile detention centers?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about how so many young people come into the system for non-serious offenses or behaviors that aren't even offenses once they turn 18, all of those kids can be diverted. All of those kids can be sent to supportive services like after-school programs, mentoring, recreation. We don't need to get kids involved in the system that has all these negative consequences for low-level offenses. And even serious kids that are involved in serious violent offending, most of them can be better treated in the community, in their homes, with their families, and it's less expensive and less damaging to families, communities, and kids to keep them home.
All right. And for us today, for the people on the Zoom, and just like generally us as a youth and activist, how can we better help? You know, how can we better contribute towards the system and try to find like safe ways and like different things so we can reach out to our peers and help them like stay out of jail?
I think that's a terrific question. And I think that I'm most optimistic when I'm thinking about how young people can be part of the solution. So I think there's really two kind of ways that you can come at this. You can either get involved with initiatives, like kind of policy initiatives that are designed to reduce harm. So, we know that locking people up is harmful. We know that sending kids to the adult system is harmful. So let's try to build policies so that fewer and fewer and fewer kids are going there. So there's legislation right now in Pennsylvania that we're trying to push through so that it's not so easy to transfer kids to the adult system. That could potentially be very powerful. But on the other hand, I think there's really good work to be done in developing non-police alternatives to everything. Right? Every social problem in our country can be addressed in the community better than it can be addressed by the criminal legal system, foster care system, or all these other systems, right? These are the systems that do harm, right? But schools, nonprofit programs, community gardens, just anything that builds solidarity and provides alternatives to police can be really powerful in reducing crime. I mean, you can plant trees and literally reduce violence in that area just from planting trees. So we don't have to lock people up. There are other ways to do this, and young people should be at the forefront of this.
Absolutely. And from a societal perspective, how can we, like as a collective, destigmatize these people who have like been through the criminal justice system?
I'm really excited by the credible mentor movement. Credible messenger, sorry. The credible messenger movement is basically a movement to leverage all of the strengths of people who are coming out of jails and prisons and foster care and those systems, and hiring them to support people in the community. Sorry, that's my dog. We have all these people coming home from prison and jail every year, and they have felony records, so it's really, really hard for them to get jobs. But they've learned all these lessons. They have all of this local knowledge. And why not pair them with young people to use them as mentors? Why not hire them as probation officers? If we still need probation officers, why not, use people who've had system experience and draw on that knowledge?
Yeah. And going based off of like all these questions about being involved in youth, how can we stay in contact with you so we can take more like steps to actually like make a change?
You can stay in touch with me anytime. You got my contact information. You can call on me to help in any way. I think this is an absolutely terrific group, and I'd be honored to join whatever efforts you're involved in where you need somebody with a little bit more, I don't know, age or experience.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with this, we'll open the question room up to the audience.
Is everyone thinking?
We don't have a question, but someone said, I work for a nonprofit that has a credible messenger mentor here in California. That's super cool.
Those are awesome programs. And I'll also say that I've been focusing on this for the last week with my graduate students, but there's a study that shows that part of the reason why we experienced such a steep decline in violence in the 90s was an expansion of nonprofit programs. So the role of nonprofits is really, really important.
All right, and if there aren't any questions or any more questions from the audience, we still have a couple more questions. Actually, we have one more question that just came in, and it's, what are your thoughts on youth who were on ankle monitors and had to be home due to COVID? What were some detrimental effects?
I think what we're encouraged to think about in terms of ankle monitors is, isn't it a lot better for the person to be home than to be in jail or prison? And yes, that's true. However, when you can't work, you can't engage with your community, whether it's your faith-based community or your local community, you can't get out and engage in activities and become kind of a prisoner in your own home, you're not really growing. You're not really connecting with people. And I guess my biggest concern about how much we use ankle monitoring now is that we're very often using it for people who might not have been locked up anyway. So it's sometimes not really the kind of alternative that we thought it was going to be. We had still have the same number of people locked up, but now we have more people who are on electronic monitor, right? We can also look at the inconsistent workings of the ankle monitors. So very often they stop working, you have to plug them in to keep them charged, or they falsely register that you're not at home. And then all of the costs of ankle monitors are generally passed on to the person who's wearing it. So this is just another form of justice debt that puts people in a financial hole. So yes, would I prefer wearing an ankle monitor to being locked up? Yes. But I don't think it's the panacea that that it's kind of presented as. Great question. Thank you.
Alrighty. One question that we have is, how likely will the jury be influenced to punish the defendant, like solely based on their preferred sexual orientation?
I think bias happens at multiple levels, right? It happens at multiple levels at once. And so I'm less interested in how individuals' unconscious biases operate like a jury, although I'm sure that happens. By the way, you should know that in the juvenile justice system, kids don't get a jury. That's one of the legal protections that's not offered to juveniles that is to adults. But I think what's more pernicious, because it's kind of invisible, is the kind of bias that gets embedded in our laws, policies, and practices. And so they seem to be happening in a neutral way, but they aren't, right? They don't have neutral outcomes. So the examples of how LGBTQ youth are navigating schools, for example, is one example. So you're wearing clothes that's meant for that administrators or teachers are saying is meant for someone else, right? Or your hair is out of compliance with school rules. So this is a way that heterosexism is built into school codes, right? Or racism is built into school codes. And so it seems sneaky. It is sneaky because it seems like it's a neutral process, but it doesn't affect people neutrally. Looking at LGBTQ youth, quite a lot of them who are rejected from their parents end up running away, which then brings them into the system. So do we need to treat them like criminals? Or is there another way to resolve the problem? I mean, we don't want people homeless, right? There are ways to address homelessness. There are ways to address unaccepting parents and families that don't involve jails. So I think I'm less interested in how juries or other decision makers are biased, and more interested in how our kind of laws and policies, the way that we write them and the way that we implement them, have disparate effects on vulnerable groups.
And like you were saying that like younger like people don't get juries, like do you think that they're still safe in like these detention centers or like juvie, like especially if they are out?
No. I think, I mean, I was really happy the last time that I toured. I took my class on a field trip to the youth detention facility here in Philly. And I was really happy to hear them say that if somebody identifies as a girl, they stay on the girls' wing. And that's great. That's really kind of progressive policy. But, a lot of these kids are vulnerable to being abused by the staff, to being beat up and abused by other people inside detention facilities. So it's a really horrible place to send a kid, any kid.
And talking about the age disparity between the people who are incarcerated, would it be easier for a younger individual or an older individual to transition back into society after spending time in jail?
Hmm. Well, I think it presents different challenges. So we're learning this firsthand because Pennsylvania leads the nation in how many people who we sentence to life without parole for crimes they committed before they were adults. And so, like I said, a lot of this was done in the 80s and 90s. And now these folks have spent like 40, 50 years in prison and are coming home. So they don't even know what smartphones are. I mean, it's just like a whole new world for them. And so in that way, the adjustment is very challenging. But for young people, we have to remember that young people are still developing. And when we lock people up, they stop developing. Psychologists call it arrested development. So let's say I'm locked up at 16 and I'm released at 19. I have the maturity of a 16-year-old. I had the opportunity to go to prom. I haven't had the opportunity to date and figure out what romantic relationships are about. I haven't had a chance to get a job and figure out what responsibility is about. And now I'm 19. I'm expected to be an adult and take on all those adult roles at once. So that can be really challenging.
All right, I think that's all the questions that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. We definitely did learn a lot today.
Thanks so much for having me. And please feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do.
We definitely will.
Take good care.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for
Thank
hosting.
you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And of course, another thank you to all the attendees. If you guys would like to get more involved with Justice Education Project, you guys can visit us at justiceeducationproject.org or follow our Instagram and social medias.
Yes.
So with that, that concludes the webinar. Thank you guys again, and take care.
All right. See you guys later. Alrighty. I think that we are done. Good job, by the way.
Yes, good job to you too.
I love working with you.
Oh my God, same here, same here.
Yeah.
See ya, bye.